do today for about 40 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have time for questions, is to talk about what I think is the most difficult challenge in the control of infections, as it is in many kinds of practice, and that is not so much the technology, but how we get ourselves to do what we're supposed to do. So I want to talk a little bit about, I want to focus on motivators for what makes us want to change or what makes us able to change, and why is it so difficult for us to change. And then to sort of reassess some of our assumptions and approaches about infection prevention. So these are a couple of titles of books that I saw recently about the functioning of the brain. These are the names of the books. Welcome to Your Brain, Why You Lose Your Car Keys But Never Forget How to Drive, The Little Book of Big Stuff, Brain Rules, 12 Principles for Surviving and Thriving at Work, Home, and School, and Saving Your Brain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about you know, how we think, and maybe how we need to change our perceptions just a bit if we're going to control healthcare-associated infections. So, for example, sneakiness increases with brain size. And deception for the express purpose of misleading requires behavioral suppleness, thank you, and is observed most often in the brainiest animals. For example, chimpanzees, a male chimpanzee flirting with a female will drop his hands to cover his erection when an alpha male strolls by. Now here's the other example, one other example is that when we have pain, it's perceived quite differently depending on the cause of the pain. Not just how bad the pain is, but the cause. If you fall off a bicycle accidentally and hurt your leg, it's going to hurt. But if somebody that you care about pushes you off a bicycle and you have the same injury, it's going to hurt more. So it's not just what we feel, but also how we perceive what's going on. And I heard a very interesting talk by this neurologist who was talking about mice that she's been studying. And she has been able to breed mice so that they're high anxiety, very depressed, and they're very low risk takers. For example, if there's a piece of food at the end of a complicated labyrinth or a tunnel, this breed of mice will not follow it. They don't want to take any risks. But she can train them so that if they have incremental successes, and even if they're small successes like playing with a toy or reaching for a toy, she has been able to modify their genetic predisposition to improve their risk-taking behavior. So all of us come with our personalities. I, for one, tend to be maybe a little bit compulsive and so forth, and I don't sleep a lot. But I can modify that behavior, not totally, but to some extent. And each of us, I think, can modify our behavior, but it takes terrific intention and perhaps changes in perception. Now, this was a very clever way that I read in the paper to use your brain. In 2008, a New York politician, actually he was a senator, protested a drunk driving charge by saying that he used alcohol hand sanitizers and they were absorbed in his body. Now, of course, that's ridiculous, but it was a deceptively clever way to try to get out of a drunk driving charge. I want to talk for a minute about perceptions from the generations. And these are stereotypes, but based to some extent, as all stereotypes are based somewhat on truth and somewhat on perception. But I'm sure you've heard this before. The baby boomers are the people born between about 1945 and 1964, currently ages 47 to 66, greater than 1/4 of the population. In the US, I think it's about the same here. Influenced by World War I, many of us in the baby boomer generation remember the first time we saw television. Contraception came in the 1960s, the Beatles, and space flight. The baby boomers in general need to be nice and cooperative. They were raised in a very large competitive generation. They sort of see the world as a win-lose operation. They care what other people think. You want to please your boss. They want to be part of a team, and recognition for this group is important. Now, the Generation Xers, born from 1965 to 1980, are about 14% of the population. They're the first latchkey kids, where both parents worked and they had to come home by themselves. They went through the civil rights, the hippies, the Vietnam War, and rock music. And Gen Xers in general don't like to participate or attend meetings. They get impatient. They don't want to necessarily hear others' opinions. Just tell me what needs to be done and I'll do it. Recognition for them is less important. They're more individualistic. They value technology, speed, continuous change. And then we have the millennials born from 1981 to present, aged about up to 31, 3 times the size of Gen Xers. And I think you have a very large population of young people here as well. This is the digital era. Teens with machines. 90% use the internet, and they're immersed in their own universe. And I don't know how it is here, but on the subway in New York, I see, sometimes I count, 20 to 40% of people on the subway have earphones in and are listening to music, which I think is dangerous on the New York subways, but anyway. These are the digital generation, texting, emailing, instant messaging. Of course, we all do that now. So the attitudes of the boomers: tell me what I need to know and let me please you. The Gen Xers: show me how to do it. The Gen Y: why do I need to do this? The challenge for us is that most of the teachers and the mentors and the preceptors are boomers. A few are Gen Xers, but most of the learners, certainly in school, are Gen Xers or Generation Y. So we have a huge gap between people who are teaching and people who are learning. And the styles are different, and the things that are meaningful are different. So one of the things we have to do for ourselves and for other people, if we want change to occur, if we want practice to get better, is to understand the language and the values and what's meaningful to the different generations. So a lot of us who are aging, who have been in healthcare for 10 years, 20 years, whatever, there are some advantages to having more experience and getting older, and there are some disadvantages. The advantages, first of all, experience brings some wisdom, hopefully, and certainly some perspective. And you can take shortcuts because you know what works and what doesn't work. So to me, it's sort of like French cooking. You have to do the whole thing exactly right the first time, and then you can take some shortcuts when you learn what isn't going to matter and what is going to matter. But there are some negatives about aging. One is that it's more difficult for us to change as we get older because we have more to lose. We have more stake in the status quo, and we don't want to lose. Often it's not financial, it's respect or our reputation. We don't want to take risks. So it's more difficult for risk-taking and for innovation. So the implications for us is that in general, we prefer doing things the way we always have. It's easier, it becomes habits, etc. We have more to protect, and we take fewer risks. Now here's from the WHO, the World Health Organization, the history of medicine. 2000 BC, here, eat this root. 1000 AD, that root is heathen, here, say this prayer. 1850, that prayer is superstition, here, drink this potion. 1920, that potion is snake oil, swallow this pill. 1945, that pill is ineffective, take this penicillin. 1955, oops, bugs mutated, here, take this tetracycline. 1960 to 2009, 39 more, oops, 39 more mutations. Here, take this more powerful antibiotic. And today, here, eat this root. This is just to show you the cycle of practice. And these are this study in the light green bars we did in 1983. in Seattle, Washington. This study in 2008, in the dark green bars, we did in New York City. The same study. What we did is we stood at the door of isolation rooms where patients were isolated. And we had a checklist. We weren't hiding. It was approved by our institutional review board. And we watched whether the staff who went in and came out washed their hands. Okay, 50%, a little over, like 45% in 1983 washed their hands before touching a patient who was known to be infected. They were in isolation. 2008, it was about 18%. And after touching patients, of course, everybody does hand hygiene more, honestly, to protect themselves than to protect the patients. So it was higher. But nevertheless, we're not getting better in terms of hand hygiene. We're getting worse. So not many things have changed. You may be familiar, this is a picture that I took in Ghana when I was there, and this is the gloves that they wash and reuse. They get a stock of gloves every week and reuse them. And as you know, we've sort of changed from the traditional hand washing to using hand sanitizer, which is faster, it has a better kill, and it's easier on the hands. But nevertheless, it's still in the process of changing. Do you use hand sanitizer here? Alcohols? Yeah. Okay. And this is the WHO 5 moments of hand washing, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. Is that right? Heard of it? Great. Okay. So let's talk about specifically what our perceptions have to do with infection prevention. Traditionally, translational research has gone from the bench to the bedside. But there's much to be learned by pushing the other way. In other words, those of us who are at the bedside need to be asking the important questions that require some research to answer. And the problems and the issues come from the bedside. They often don't come from the bench. So the first thing we need to do, I think, is to remember our core mission. And our core mission as healthcare providers, of course, is to do the best we can to not hurt the patients and hopefully make them better. But sometimes I think we sort of forget our core mission. Now here, I just bought an electric toothbrush last year. Here's the instructions for using the electric toothbrush. Insert brush into mouth. Never use while sleeping. Designed for cleaning teeth only. Do not use for any other purpose. You can imagine what else you'd use an electric toothbrush for. But my point here is that that's pretty sad when you have to buy an electric toothbrush and they tell you to put it in your mouth and not use it while you're sleeping. Somebody forgot the core missions along the way somewhere. I don't know. This is a sign from McDonald's on a coffee cup. Caution, contents may be hot. Well, I hope so, because I wanted hot tea, I wanted hot coffee. But again, I mean, that came again because somebody sued McDonald's, you know, because they got burned on the coffee. But nevertheless, the core mission of a coffee cup is to have hot coffee. I recently read a book by Oliver Sacks, who is a neurologist, and very interesting. My son is a musician, and my daughter-in-law is a musician. So I was interested in this book because he has shown that thinking about music results in the same changes in your brain as actually listening to music. So the things that we imagine and think about can actually have the same kind of an impact as doing them. So that's amazing to me. I think that is just amazing. So I want us to imagine the future of infection prevention. First of all, what do we assume about infections? And I think we'd all agree with this. Germs are everywhere. Most of them are fine. Hospitals are dangerous places for people. They're also useful places. And when we need them, thank heavens they're here. But the more degrees you have, the less you wash your hands. That's often the case. And microbes are wily change artists and get ahead of any antibiotic that's devised. And we often forget, at least the pharmaceutical industry when a new antibiotic comes out, everybody races to it like it's a panacea, and it's only a matter of time before resistance starts. And as you know, that was the story with methicillin and vancomycin and imipenem and everything else. So what else do we know? Excellent hygiene practices, like hand hygiene, do reduce infections. The data are pretty clear on that. But universal precautions only work when they are totally universal. Every patient, every worker, every time. And that just doesn't happen. Infections don't all start in hospitals, but they certainly enjoy life there. So the other problem is that prevention is very hard to sell, because you can't say, look at all the patients who didn't get an infection because of what I did. Whereas if a surgeon, cardiac surgeon, makes a mistake, cuts the wrong thing, or does something wrong, there's immediate feedback. It's terrible. It's a disaster. But what happens if you don't do hand hygiene and don't comply with the isolation precautions, and 2 weeks later or 1 week later somebody gets an infection? There's no way that we can say it's because on this day this nurse or this physician did not do what they were supposed to do. So it's a hard sell, because there are so many factors that go into causing an infection that to isolate a single factor is essentially impossible. Nevertheless, there are clear data about certain things related to hygiene, and yet it's a repetitive, boring proposition that we fail to do. And hand hygiene is probably the worst. It's also a very tough environment in which we work in hospitals. It's very high uncertainty. Things happen all the time that you're not expecting. It's very high risk. So, the work can get tedious and boring sometimes, but in general, what we're doing is high risk. And the things that we're expected to know and do are sometimes scary. It's hierarchical, highly structured communication patterns. Who you talk with, when, and in what order is dependent in part by what your title is and sort of where you are in the power hierarchy and the structure. We often have strong professional but weak institutional identity. So we identify ourselves as a surgeon, a physician, a nurse, an organ transplant person, but we may feel less institutional identity and loyalty, although I think here, many of you have been here a long time, and so there's also the institutional identity. And then there are perceived or real variations in the goals among staff and administration. So I think it's very, very hard as one individual to make a change. I'll give you an example. When I was a nursing student many years ago, I worked as a nursing assistant on the night shift to pay for my school. And on the night shift, the nursing assistants, the first month I was there, they said, when are you taking your sick day this month? And I said, well, I'm not sick, so I'm not going to take a sick day. And they said, well, you have to, because we get one sick day a month, and if you don't take it, we're going to be mad at you because it makes us look bad. So it was a huge pressure from that culture and that system to do something that was, against what I thought was the right thing to do. So you can't change your behavior if you're in a system that doesn't support the kind of guidelines and behavior that you want. Our clients should not be individual people. What really has to happen, I think, is to change the system in which we work so that the expectation, similar to going into the operating room, you can't go into surgery if you don't do some kind of a preoperative prep of your hands. You simply can't. And if you try, somebody will stop you. But you can't do that on the units where we work because it's not part of our culture, it's not part of our expectations. So we need to step back and think it through and look at the perceptions is I talked about the fact that the way we perceive things, we may be looking at the exact same thing and perceive them very differently. So let's look at various sides, various viewpoints, the patient, the family, the caregivers, etc. So what does the patient want and their family when they come to the hospital? Well, they want to get out as soon as they can, in general, and be healthier, hopefully be well. They certainly don't want to get any other problems while they're with us, such as an infection. And the family doesn't want their loved one, their family, to come home with multiple problems. From the point of view of us, the caregivers, we think, I'm working hard. I'm already doing the best I can. I don't want to be belittled by slogans or slaps. I want people to recognize what I'm doing. I want to be respected, and I want to do the right thing. And sometimes we think maybe management doesn't understand how little support I get to do the right things. Support staff may think they, the administration or somebody, require more computer work that keeps me from having time to think. Every unit has at least one do-it-my-way person. No one explains things to me. I'm too busy to think about this. The front office, the top management, we're punished for things beyond our control. I can't help it if the budget is cut, okay? So they don't understand, I need to cut the budget, and that's just the way it is. Clinical staff don't appreciate how much we're doing. It can't be that hard to get everyone to clean their hands. It is, but I'm tired of excuses, and I thought we fixed this. So how and why do people change? We can't change unless it's worth our while, because it takes a lot of energy. So there's got to be something in it. Either professional pride, peer pressure. I do it because I want to be the best I can and I need to learn something new. I do it because everybody around me is doing it, and if I don't do it, I'm going to look odd, or this is the thing in this culture. Or economics, either a financial reward or some kind of gain or loss of business. So that's why we change. And mental paradigms are important. I was raised in the time before polio immunizations. In fact, I was in one of the early trials of the polio vaccine. I got the placebo, and I actually had polio. I had measles, I had mumps, all those things that now we don't see very much. And so people raised in the post-polio, post-measles era often think differently about vaccines. So you hear people who say, well, my children, I'm not going to vaccinate them because of this myth about autism, or I don't need to anymore because the disease is gone. Now we're having a measles outbreak in New York City right now. We haven't seen it for decades. And then Florence Nightingale, she was totally wrong. She did not believe in germs at all. She thought that to believe in germs was against God. She said, how could God create something that you can't see that could be bad? But she did the right things for the wrong reasons. So she fixed, the hygiene. And so sometimes, even if we do the right things for the wrong reasons, it's better than not acting at all. So these are some of this was a survey of several thousand physicians taken about why the physicians are unwilling or don't want to follow guidelines. What are the barriers for practice guidelines? First of all, maybe these are what the physician said. I don't know about it, or I'm not familiar with it. Or I know about it, but I don't believe it. I don't agree with this practice guideline. I don't agree that that the evidence is strong enough. I simply don't agree. Another reason, I don't feel like I'm trained to do that. Lack of self-efficacy. Another is, okay, even if I do this, I don't think anything's going to happen that's any better. So a lack of outcome expectancy, I don't think it's going to help. So why bother? And then the last is, I've always done it the way I do it. It works okay. Why should I bother to change? So what's interesting is that if you want to change behavior, either yours or some others, the same interventions aren't going to work for everybody, because it depends on why it is What's the barrier that's keeping you from changing? So obviously, sometimes our efforts to educate staff are in-service, talks, or like this, or educational things. But if the issue has nothing to do with education and knowledge, it's irrelevant to do education. So you have to think of other ways that might be more helpful. So making the future, let's think about how we can move things and improve things. First of all, in terms of the social environment, how does the physical space where we work affect the way we interact with each other? And just the unit where we work makes a difference in who we're going to talk to, when we're going to talk, etc. What are our learned behaviors that govern who we speak to and when? And what assumptions are made about who decides on strategies in what circumstances? So George Bernard Shaw said that the single biggest mistake in communication is the belief that it has taken place. So we think when we say something, people are hearing what we mean, and that's not necessarily the case. So I want to look at infection prevention from points of view of different disciplines and different expertise. Information technology, the computer folks, they say, we need good technology to improve communication. We need good websites, we need fast email, etc. A sociologist would say, we need mutual trust, a shared culture, and team building. The regulatory people, and we have a lot of regulation in the US, more and more, and in fact, now hospitals, starting last year, are no longer being paid for patients if they get certain kinds of infections. So if they get an infection related to after they've been in the hospital, they no longer get money. They have to pay for it themselves. So the regulatory matters are very important. And also now we have 29 of our 50 states that mandate public reporting of healthcare infection rates. So you can go on the internet and you can look up a hospital and you can get their rates. Now the idea is that this will evoke change because of one of the things I was talking about, peer pressure, respect. One of the reasons you change is you don't want to ruin your reputation. But it's very interesting to think about what the untoward problems might be with that. For example, not taking patients who are likely to get an infection and sending them elsewhere. So we're studying right now actually what might happen when these changes occur. And then human resources might say we need supervision and incentives. But the reality is that it's a complex problem, infection prevention, just like any other practices that we have. So approaching prevention from one viewpoint only means that we are a little right and mostly wrong, and ever changing. We used to have sort of the shame and blame model that, if something happens, whose fault is it? And then we're moving from a focus now from individuals to systems, and yet now we're trying to balance how much of it is the problem of changing the system and how much of the problem is the responsibility of the individual. So I think there are only two tools for effecting improved infection prevention behaviors. One is to design systems and the way we work so that it's very easy to do the right thing and it's hard to do the wrong thing. And the other is to help each other make the right choices. And I think we need both. As I said, you cannot change unless you really, really work at it if you're in a system where nobody else is doing the same thing. So for something like hand hygiene, if everybody, you can't change all by yourself. We need simple rules. No patient should be harmed by an infection. Targeting 0 infections is a laudable goal. It may not be possible, but we should target that. We used to say from the Centers for Disease Control that only about 30% of healthcare-associated infections were preventable, but we now know that it's far, far more than that, and probably 80% are preventable. Some you can't prevent because people toward the end of their life or when they're immunosuppressed and very, very high risk are at such risk of infections you can't prevent it. But we probably can prevent the majority of healthcare-associated infections. The leaders must deliver clear expectations and set goals and provide resources. And then the idea is that everybody is responsible, not the infection prevention staff, and not the hospital epidemiologist, or not the infectious disease physician, but all of us are responsible. So I don't think that you have these bundles or guidelines, but they're very popular now in the US. Basically, it's a collection of evidence-based guidelines that you put in a checklist. And for example, if somebody's putting in a central venous line, that there's a checklist. You know, you wear gloves, you do hand hygiene, sterile technique, et cetera, and the staff are empowered to stop the procedure if there's a break in any of the technique. And these have been extremely successful, and in fact, they've, in some hospitals, there have been no central line infections for months and months and months, which is amazing. Now, why does that work? There's nothing new in those checklists. Not one thing is new. The difference is that it's all together, it's simple. And I think the reason that they're working is because, first of all, there's overt support to empower you to stop something that's not going right. And most of us don't have, you know, that kind of power, if you will, or that kind of impetus. We're not allowed to necessarily, depending on where we are in the hierarchy. People feel that they're part of a movement, this checklist thing. They say, yes, I'm using this checklist in my unit. There are simple, clear, measurable actions. It's no secret. You know exactly what you're supposed to do, in what order you're supposed to do it. That doesn't mean the checklist doesn't change, and it can, but they're very clear to measure. And there's clear outcomes. Are the bloodstream infections from central lines reducing in rates? Clear outcome. And so they address both a personal need for respect and doing the right thing, as well as organizational need for change, because the organization sort of buys into it. But we can't change all at once, and people get discouraged if they try. So for us, I think it's important, out of a list of all things that you might find to be problematic, to select some priority and work on that. Now, when I was at Soroka earlier this week in Beersheba, one of the intensive care physicians told me about a really great idea where every week he puts up papers and focuses on one practice. So it might be insertion of catheters. It might be one thing or another. And the staff have a little pre-test, and then they read these things, and then they have a little post-test. I think one a week is too many. But he says after the first year, after 51 weeks, he's going to, again, check the staff and see how their behavior is. Kind of a neat idea. I think once a week is too much, but nevertheless, it was a great idea. So in an ideal world, sometimes we think, let me figure out what to do, tell everybody else, and then they should do it. Unfortunately, the sociology of healthcare epidemiology and of infection prevention and in our practice is that major challenges are systemic and interpersonal and interprofessional, not so much scientific. So we can always use new products and we can always use new technology. But to me now, where we need the expertise is in the behavioral sciences and how we can make these systems and organizational changes. I'd like to end with just a discussion about the importance of leadership. This was a study that was done in 14 US hospitals. And the aim of the study was to understand which leader behaviors are associated with improved prevention of healthcare-associated infections. And what they found is that if these characteristics were present in the leaders, there was actually a reduced rate of healthcare-associated infections from the influence of the leadership, which then flows through the system. Cultivating the leader who cultivates a culture of excellence, who communicates this to staff very explicitly. I am, with you on this. This is what I want. Focus on overcoming barriers, not just ignoring the fact that it's hard. Dealing directly with resistant staff. Actually meeting with them, talking to them. What's the problem? How can I help you? What's going on? Inspiring, thinking strategically, leveraging their personal prestige, and forming interdisciplinary partnerships. When those characteristics were there, the infection rates were actually lower. So the common elements for success in infection prevention and really in any practice change is a clearly articulated purpose, and for us, it's aiming toward zero healthcare infections, strong leadership, contributions by everybody, not just the infectious disease folks, work products so that you can see successes along the way, and then a minimal waste of time and resources. Nobody likes to sit in committee meetings where nothing ever happens. So with that, the way we move forward is shared vision, a sense of urgency, and an empowered team. So thank you very much.